All right, folks. In today's episode, I'm going to be doing an article review of a 1941 article from Manly Hall titled "Soul Power" from Daily News. And before I jump into this, a couple notes. I do have a new zine coming and a whole bunch of content on the way. I'm waiting to get it from the printers before I jump into all that, and it got delayed, so it'll be a couple more weeks. Um, so until then, I'm going to do a couple other things that are not on the topic of depth psychology because that's what the primary focus of the new zine is. So as I noted, this article comes out in 1941, so right at the cusp of World War II, and I think a lot of Manly Hall's best material, some of my favorite articles from him, come from this World War II era. Um, and a lot of his essential books and writings are also from this period. It was a highly important time in his career. So in this article, he takes on the topic of news, or the philosophy of news, the philosophy of the individual looking out into the world and trying to make sense of current events. Um, and now to tie this in a little bit with the new zine in terms of the astrology, in January 2020, we had a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. If you look at that cycle between when those planets meet, the cycle of conjunctions between those two planets, it goes in a 33 to 37 year orbit pattern or cycle pattern. And within that cycle, the conjunction is not the only important point. You also have squares, oppositions, and trines. And the zine, I focus on the relationship between the squares, oppositions, and the conjunctions. Those are called the hard aspects. And it's interesting that World War One began, I believe, at the conjunction between Saturn and Pluto that took place in, I might be getting the years wrong off the top of my head, but I want to say 1914. Um, and then World War II kicked off at almost the exact moment of Saturn Pluto opposition. And if we look at 9/11, that happened at a point, it was called a Grand Cross. It was Saturn Pluto opposition with a Sun Moon opposition forming a cross in the sky. That was 9/11 and setting the stage for the war on terror, the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, and the sort of like big push with the neocons. And now in 2021, we have the global lockdowns and the mandates and the Great Reset, all of that happening at a point with a Saturn Pluto conjunction happens once again. So we have this dynamic relationship between these two archetypes, the Saturn archetype and the Pluto archetype, that their pattern is really closely tied to current global affairs, particularly ones that interface with the so-called deep state in the U.S. national security state. So the national security state and the deep state interface very closely with the media. Why would that be? Well, because there's an interesting book by a geopolitical analyst named F. William Engdahl. It's called Full Spectrum Dominance. And in that book, he does a good job laying out the psychology of the national security state and the idea that it's sort of like a paranoid mind state, but you can understand strategically why it would emerge in an environment of intense competition or absolute competition. But it's basically that if science can study it, if mankind can know something about a certain field, then strategically the defense state must dominate that field, must leverage the knowledge to express its will. Because if it doesn't, then it leaves an opening, a vacuum, so to speak, for another power to come in and do that. So it's sort of it's a psychology of a race to the bottom, essentially. And part of that is the human cognition, the human mind, the mass psychology, and the idea that if we don't dominate our own mass, our own the psychology of our own people, then another power will come in and do that. And so so that's the full spectrum dominance psychology. And we're going to be getting into some of those themes in this article because in 1941, Manly Hall, very observant as always, notes that this dynamic has been even at this point has been going on for some time. And in fact, before we kick off, I want to rewind back a little bit to the World War One era, and I think it's from the World War One era. But I want to read a quote, a famous quote from Edward Bernays, who was one of the pioneers of sort of both studying and analyzing mass human psychology or group psychology, and at the same time applying that use for military and national security purposes and or corporate and financial marketing and expansion purposes. All right, so Edward Bernays, he writes, the conscious, intelligent manipulation of the organized opinions and habits of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. In almost every aspect of our lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires that control the public mind. So I'm saying that not to emphasize the fear aspect of it, which is that, oh, we're being controlled and manipulated, which, I mean, if you're at all self-aware, you should understand that that's true. But keeping in mind the larger philosophical themes that we deal with on this channel, the emergence of this activity, this mass formation activity on the part of the collective, and this activity among the elite to herd this collective psychology, this is an evolutionary phase. This is a stage that mankind has reached and is going through and playing itself out. And we're, in the early 100 years ago, at the era of World War One, it was at an early stage, but was still very effective. I mean, propaganda had a lot to do with the U.S. getting into World War One, and then it advanced to a higher degree during World War II, both domestically, but particularly with in Germany, with not just the Nazi Party, but particularly the SS and the empowerment of that sort of occult elite group. They advanced their researches in human psychology to a high degree and then leverage that understanding and knowledge in terms of manipulating Germany to get into the war. And to manipulate the sort of masses. And then after World War II, I think you see within the U.S. this national security state culture come into play, such as that suggested by Eisenhower in his famous address, with the idea of this full spectrum dominance psychology coming into the forefront of the bureaucracy or the technocracy that emerged after World War II in the context of the Cold War. So we see an evolutionary trajectory to this dynamic, and now it exists to a level of enhancement that is certainly more advanced than we can really grapple with. I mean, part of it seems, has to do with electromagnetic entrainment, which is something that is affecting directly the subconscious. That's completely outside of anybody's control. And then certainly the understanding of psychology and social psychology is very advanced. So people who are operating in think tanks or certain specialists in marketing and public relations have a lot of tools, advanced tools that they can leverage to get what they want, to pursue and succeed in whatever objectives that they may have in terms of their organization that they're working on behalf. So we're seeing an evolutionary motion that is, in a way, a recapitulation of this Atlantean archetype. It's one of the reasons I did this at that Atlantis zine, is because the Atlantean archetype is this idea that science becomes misused and it breeds into a situation or feeds into a situation where that misuse of knowledge ends up corrupting the civilization to such a degree that it collapses in on itself. And in a way, we see that archetype playing itself out today. And as I talked about in previous videos, I don't believe that the archetype is meant to play itself out exactly the same way as it did in Atlantis. We're on a different cycle now. And so while we may be revisited by that karma, we are intended to actually learn lessons that we didn't learn before and achieve to a higher state than what the Atlantean civilization attained before it collapsed. So, but the death and rebirth cycle involved in all this could be one that does lead to the collapse or a death of a certain paradigm of civilization. Perhaps this paradigm of incessant competition between nations, between corporations, etc., based on this premise of scarcity of resources, scarcity of money and finance and debt. And so a move into a different paradigm of social organization. It seems that however things play out, the sort of symbolism of the Great Reset and the idea that things are being deconstructed globally in a way that there doesn't seem to be a going back to normal. There only seems to be a transition, a sort of gradual transition, maybe with some abrupt moments into a new paradigm. So anyway, all that is sort of feeding into the context of why I think this article is important, because what's happening in the media today, when you look at just individual cases about how the media is treating, like, such as the new, quote, I don't even know how to say it, Omicron variant, and this idea that we all need to lock down again, or just this hysteria, nonstop fear and hysteria in the news, and then nonstop race baiting and divide and conquer kind of things among the people. So just the larger questions of what the highly destructive role that the media plays in our society and sort of poisoning the human mind. We're going to be dealing with the themes of how do we go about, as people who are interested in philosophy or want to adopt the philosopher viewpoint into our lives, how do we navigate this treacherous space? We're going to turn to Manly Hall here in this article and get some guidance. So he starts off by saying, there are times when it is difficult to live the principles we believe. One of those times is now. Again, writing in 1941. He says, each day we gather up all that we can muster of common sense, detachment, and sound judgment, and resolve that this time we shall meet the dawn of tomorrow with understanding and high purpose. But then comes the morning paper. Woe is us. We just take a little peek at the main headlines, and boom, we become discouraged. He writes, what's to be believed about victories and defeats, air raids, and the sinking of ships, the nonstop fear coming in. By no known means can we hope to extract the whole truth out of so much that is deliberately false. So it's interesting that he notes that these things are deliberately false. Now, I don't think he's implying here that, all the reports about the war were made up, but there definitely were reports of the sinking of, I can't remember what the name of the ship was, the Lusitania or something like that. There were certain false flags, I guess I'll say, that lead into the onset of America joining World War II, that were intended to co-opt public opinion. So the sort of like coordination between the national security state and the media back then was even heavy. But then he notes world conditions are changing with almost incredible rapidity. Innumerable difficulties of censorship and distance have to be daily overcome. And on practically any item that trickles through is imposed the heavy hand of national policies and designs of government leadership. So again, he's pretty much referencing this idea that the news is not some objective standard, or the news is not just objective information that's coming to us cleanly, that there's a number of filters that it passes through, a number of biases and sort of strategic viewpoints that it passes through before it reaches us. So we're getting a highly intentioned product, I guess I would say, when we read the news. The problem with the news, for the philosopher, the problem with the news, as with all things, is to find out why things have happened as they have. Not just the news stories, but also this whole process of the news, of the media as an organizational entity. Why have things happened as they have? And then find, behind all this information, find the central governing principle. He says, what is missing are the guideposts to an intelligent thinking through. For without something in terms of standards or ethics or even normal attitudes towards mankind, there can be no clear path to the meaning of all that is going on. Nothing is gained by ignoring world news. So even though the situation is treacherous, the philosopher has to navigate it rather than turn their back towards the situation. Nothing is gained by ignoring it. It is futile to attempt to wipe out of our consciousness the state of the world catastrophe. Which is frustrating to me at this current point, because I do feel like we're at this historical moment in time, and that things are moving to increasingly into a great transformation. And I see in my own personal life, in my social life, so much apathy. He writes, in contemplation of misfortune, we gain strength. Intelligent adjustment can be made to any state of world condition, no matter how dismal. It is philosophy's belief that all situations exist to be studied and to be defined, and then to be established in their relationship to a central governing principle. We have to accept that the thing has happened in a certain way. And then, so rather than approach everything from the standpoint of opinionism or fighting against what the reality is, the philosopher has to first accept that things are happening in the way that they are, and in a sort of detached, neutral way almost. I try to take a bird's eye view of the situation, and then I try to objectively determine why did things perhaps go in this direction. And then he says, he kind of recommends a pathway of reasoning to follow. He writes, the steps in reasoning are based on the full conviction that the universe is dominated and controlled by a sort of cosmic intelligence, and that spiritual principles are at the root of all activities in this world. So that's the foundation. No matter what we're seeing in the world, we should always ground ourselves in this immutable understanding that there's a spiritual foundation that is immovable, and that all activity is happening upon this immovable foundation. And so whether things are happening good or bad, we have to understand those things as polarities happening in relation to this fixed spiritual concept. So spiritual principles are at the root of all of our understanding, no matter what topic you're going into. The mission of philosophy is to seek truth, find law, and find reason without outraging common sense and denials of the obvious. So don't be naive, but be idealistic. And the idealism is based on this grounding of things in a spiritual context. So first off, looking intelligently, now going back into the news, how can we apply this to the news? Looking intelligently at our daily newspaper, we can see that the record of consequences to a civilization which man built up without an adequate philosophy of life. So that basically, he's saying that what we read, this is a quote, what we read are news accounts of what happens inevitably to a world dominated by ignorance. So the news is, everything that we're reading about in the news is an account of the consequences of ignorance that plays out, that manifests itself in various ways. So the ignorance could be in a local crime or murder. It could be in a national war, or it could be in some policy that's heading into the wrong direction in terms of environmentally or economically. Each of those is a manifestation of ignorance, either on the individual level, a sort of organizational level, or a national level. But the main thing is ignorance, superstition, and fear are the three evils that lead to all the different corruptions. So he says that's the first thing that news means. News is a report of human ignorance. It brings before our eyes the consequences of our actions based on ignorance. These actions arise from a lack of essential knowledge that there is a law behind the game of life and that we have to play it according to the rules. Daily news is the chronicle of what happens to those who ignore the law, who deny the law. It discloses for us the fundamental principle beneath world difficulties of this time, and of all other times, which is lack of adjustment between human institutions and universal law. So, explaining more what he means here. Men have not built civilization according to the pattern of the place and space which it occupies within a universal scheme. Space is ruled by motions, laws, and tides that are continually flowing through it. They are motions intrinsic and inherent. They require no sense of the personal in their administration. They are absolute universal laws. These laws are inflexible. They are great enough to govern the motions of suns, yet they are small and gentle and intricate enough to control the dancing of atoms in space. They flow through every branch of human activity. They exist in every department of human life. They extend upward from man into space and downward from man to the molecule, level of the molecule. Again, they are inflexible, absolute, and unchangeable. Man, or mankind, may work with them, and by applying what he discovers of these laws, he may accomplish greatly. But if for any reason he works against them and does not follow the law, but rather follows his own law, like the old saying, not thy will but mine, if for any reason he goes against the law, then he is destroyed. And so again, this is going back to what do we see in these accounts of the news of mankind destroying itself. It's a anthology of consequences that arise from ignorance. So he writes, governments founded without consideration of the principles of universal government will fall, and human ambitions that run contrary to divine purpose cannot survive. Human institutions have for thousands of years been set up in conflict with this one principle of law, and have flagrantly ignored the necessity of our need to adjust our own desires to the divine plan. And then he writes, nothing can survive which rotates or vibrates contrary to the universal pattern. And so, the very height and supreme pinnacle of wisdom is to know what the pattern is, to learn the law and then obey the law. So having discovered the nature of the pattern, the wise person applies this knowledge, meaning that if mankind as a whole were at a more mature level, we would learn collectively, our leaders would learn the knowledge and then apply it to our institutions so that it becomes institutionalized within society. So either we apply the law to the thing we are doing, or we must recognize that what we're building cannot and will not survive. Now, keeping all this in mind, he writes, if we do keep this in mind, when we look at the morning newspaper, possessed with this kernel of realization, We'll have a new sense of values with which to understand and estimate the significance of the news. So this is a lesson, again, we can apply to today, even though this is written concerning the beginnings of World War II. We're going through a type of social war, a great collective conflict that's happening worldwide. And yet, even though the specifics are different, the lessons that we can learn are the same, which is key, because the spiritual foundation of our analysis of the situation does not change, because that spiritual foundation never changes. The world of change is this transient world of form, but this transcendent world of the spirit is immovable. It's firm. It's fixed. It's the eternal context. All right. So next up, he writes that the universe unquestionably desires that all its creatures abide together in a concept of peace. But beyond any doubt or question, peace is not going to come merely because we want it, nor because it is cosmically right. Peace will come ultimately, and law will ultimately establish itself, but not until people themselves become vehicles and become the manifestation themselves, the vessels through which peace can operate. Meaning, peace will come when we stop manifesting war, or when we stop manifesting conflict. And then he writes, personal action then is the root and branch of such problems as world peace. So until we become peaceful in our hearts, or we become mature enough to, and self-responsible enough to ensure peace, if we allow ourselves to be belligerent and be competitive and be in conflict, then the universe will not give us peace. It's our responsibility to make peace and ensure peace, beginning with the individual. And that's sort of the basis of the philosophic democracy, is that the true democracy, enlightened democracy, will not come until the nation has a sufficient level of mature individuals to ensure that enlightened nation. He says, prayers for peace and platitudes regarding peace and leagues for the promotion of peace will be impotent. As long as there is no peace in the hearts of men. So peace cannot be legislated. It has to be established, released, and revealed. We do not publicly vote peace into manifestation, but release it through our own lives, through ourselves. The good thing that we desire shall be accomplished only as we release peace through our own consciousness. Universal laws must come into manifestation naturally, like the growth of plants. They cannot be forced by the optimism of small minorities. For mankind, all good things must come to man through man. And he says that it is impossible for any good to come to human life except through humanity bringing that good into fruition. The weakness of man and not the failure of the universe is what actually is confronting us. Man, in the course of time, will come into his great philosophic empire, but it is a state to be brought about only through ages of study and growth. And then going into some of the individual approaches now to looking at this, to looking at the world situation, he writes that each individual can, in his own right, set himself to the task of accepting what he reads in his newspaper as the basis of a program of self-improvement. What is going on in the world, he can consider the content of a great textbook, one which he is going to study and from which he is going to derive his working idealism, his productive, constructive viewpoint, and his new appreciation of all the values of life. In the light of a new sense of personal integrity, he can try to find the law as that law works and operates through the things that are happening in the world. Of himself, he can demand the right to participate in the reality of life. And then going a little bit further into some of the constructive and productive viewpoints that we can take as we look at the trials and tribulations of the world situation, he focuses on the idea of karma, of using it as something we already talked about, but understanding that karma is highly related to the consequences of wrong action and wrong thinking. So another way to look at news is to see in it the working out of in world affairs of the law of cause and effect. We can observe life as a laboratory within which a vast experimental process is taking place. And within this vast experimental process, we should appreciate and understand how closely luck and merit are linked, and how closely cause and effect follow each other, and how rapidly the law works, and how inevitably corruption destroys itself. All this comes from simply sitting back and meditating upon what is occurring around us. The law is there, it is working, and if we're thoughtful, we can see it. We often become so agitated and so upset over the temporary that we overlook law. The press makes us sort of demigods. We sit on high Olympus at our morning breakfast table, and the world is unfolding about us through the news, through reading the news, or it seems as if that's the case. And we see the affairs and problems and lives of innumerable people evolving and playing themselves out within our field of awareness through the printing of ink and paper or through YouTube or whatever it is nowadays. So through these media, we share the experiences of people in becoming aware of some of the extraordinary complexes they take on, the perplexities with which they involve themselves. And this whole situation of having so much information come at us demands that we seek a philosophy big enough to find a place for the problems of all these multitudes of people. So we need to find a philosophy that can search out the motives and impulses that cause people to do the things that they do. Out of that understanding, the seeking out and finding of that principle that can explain human psychology and behavior on this mass scale, we will find soul power, the power of principle, the power of light, the power of integrity, the power to rebuild our world. So the need one of the needs that we have to find in our philosophy is to find a fundamental hope, not a blind optimism, but a substantial, intelligent hope that is based on the law. It is to be found in the realization that there is a plan and that the plan is working. Universal law is the one reality, the solid rock and refuge. It is that which can never fail and that which will endure. It will bring all things finally into harmony and pattern within itself. Law is the great pattern purpose. Law makes us one with hope, and one with purpose, and one with truth. To know this law is philosophy, to love it is religion, and to practice it is science. This law is the thing that makes life worthwhile, livable, and endurable. To all of us, it not only justifies existence, it glorifies it. It makes it just for us to suffer. It makes it noble and great for us to experience. It makes it divinely necessary for us to learn. Out of all learning, seeking, and experiencing, there is coming one thing. Someday we are going to love that law as we love nothing else in life. It is the absolute justice. It is the one justice that cannot be compromised, the justice that is eternally fulfilling, the justice that is forever working things out according to adequate principles and adequate reasons, and that law is our divine foundation. It is something that exists in space. It makes space a part of us, and it makes us part of experience. It binds us all together in the motion of progress. It is truth coming of age in time and eternity. Wars, strife, dictators and generals, despots and tyrants come and go. They are like little motes dancing in the sunbeams, but the law goes on. In the law, the great and small, the rich and poor, the powerful and humble, are all parts of a plan, the law eternally working. One of the great privileges that the news, consuming the news, he writes in the morning paper, but we're more likely to consume the news now on social media or through the TV, God forbid. But one of the great privileges we have in having this access to information of the world, even though it be highly biased and regulated and censored. But nonetheless, the privilege of this information is the chance to study this information intelligently to find their proof that the law is working. Horrible things may shock us when we first encounter them, but when analyzed dispassionately, devoutly, and insistently, they become proofs of law. He says the universe presents eternal change, but the law goes on forever. So if thousands of young men are dying, they have lived, and they will live and die again. Nations that have had an existence too short for their great dreams and hopes have lived and died, but they will live again. There is no beginning nor end for human progress. Nothing that man has ever built that is good will be lost, and nothing evil that man has built is ever sustained. Beneath all changes taking place, the great permanence of law. It decrees and declares that throughout all time and eternity, all motion is toward the real. So through the law and through experience and through trial and error, we are growing up. Nothing is happening that is not necessary to our growing up. And then in a deeper, again, reincarnation concept, he says the only death that happens is for those who believe in death. And even they cannot die. They only seem to die. Nothing that is real can perish, as nothing that is false can live. The great changes taking place in the world today all head toward the great reality, the reality of adequate purpose. So it must be, going back to the idea of law as the great justice, it must be right that men shall suffer until men learn. As long as man is less than what he's potential, what he's capable of, he must suffer the pain of the interval between himself and the thing that he was destined to be. That pain is the price of his progress. It is the force that is moving us as human beings triumphantly on to accomplishment. It is the birth pain of humanity. It is the power that is gradually transforming us from animals into gods. We are immortal creatures dreaming a dream of mortality and believing that we live and die. We think we kill and can be killed. We hold our little viewpoints to be important, our opinions tremendous, our policies and politics cosmic. All the matters we are concerned about are of great pith and only of the moment. In reality, we are neither persons nor are we problems as we think we are. We are minute particles of universal law dancing and floating in the midst of law, destined by a power beyond our control to obey the law, and destined ultimately to find happiness, fulfillment, completeness, and security for ourselves and our world when we finally adjust ourselves to this law. So peace ultimately comes to those who find reality in all that occurs, truth in all that happens, and wisdom in things as they are. So those are my notes for this article. Keep in mind that behind the many selves is the one self, and that this self is a spiritual being that is manifesting itself as a host of material beings. And each material being has a lower and a higher self. So my lower self is the ego identity, but the higher self is this spiritual self. And ultimately all spiritual selves are one, meaning there is one great spiritual self that has partitioned itself into the experience of being a host of billions of evolving souls. And each of those evolving souls experiences itself in a physical lifetime as an ego personality occupying a body. So remember, the spirit, soul, body, that's the trinity that is formed when the great God consciousness moves into its creative aspect. So ultimately we go through all these cycles, these trials and tribulations, for the spirit goes through them. but the spirit goes to them through the vehicle of the soul, and then the soul catalyzes these experiences for the spirit by occupying and building bodies. So that's the relationship. Remember, in philosophy, we always triangulate. So keep in mind spirit, soul, body, or you could say consciousness, mind, and form. Those are the same, two different ways of saying the same thing. But the material form, behind that material form, animating it is the soul. And then the energetic source of the soul, the spiritual source, is consciousness, pure abstract consciousness. So no matter what's happening in the world, no matter what you're confronted with, there's a meaning and purpose behind these things that are karmic in nature. And if you look at it that way, idealistically, you can see that this karma is not just punishment, but it's an opportunity to learn and grow. So you can take the pain as necessary and inevitable, understand that you don't know what your prior lives have played out and how those experiences in those past lives have stimulated what you're going through today, as well as things that you've done in this lifetime that are coming back to you. But always keep in mind that we're here to carry the cross, so to speak, which means that we're here to go through these experiences and these sufferings as a type of growth process that will awaken gradually the spiritual reality that's at the core of each of us. And so that is the basis of philosophy, esoteric philosophy, and that's the basis of Manly Hall's teachings, is to always keep that spiritual reality in mind. And the spiritual reality is the law, is grounded in the law. It's consciousness at one with law. And that law is universal and ubiquitous, and is only at this level of the material form in which that spiritual consciousness is not yet reawakened that we have this period where mankind can have the free will to go against the law. We can choose to not obey, but we suffer inevitably as a result. And through enough suffering, we'll gradually learn that it is our own departure from the law that is the cause of our suffering. So, in reading the news and reading the media and being depressed at the state of the world, which is inevitable, there is a philosophical approach that you can take that will open your perspective and hopefully inspire you to not be overwhelmed by things, but to ground yourself in where you are and understand that where you are, as all this other stuff is playing out, the specific place that you are occupying is meant for you. It's a product of your own karma, I guess I would say. The law has put you here, and if you can look at it that way and try to be constructive about how, and strategic about how you're going to react to the situation that you're in, you can learn the lessons that you're intended to learn through periods of trial and tribulation like what we're going through. And that's something that I try to continually remind myself, because I'm not on easy street where I'm at. I'm going through a lot of trials and tribulations myself, but I don't allow myself to get emotionally down or overwhelmed by it, because I really do try to internalize these teachings and try to extract the lessons that I think are available for me to extract so I can continue to grow in my life, and continue to try to be good and do good and to serve the one self, the great spiritual self, the God within. So that's my episode for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. And again, I'll have a lot of new content, a new zine coming out. Thanks to everybody who's supported me so far in terms of buying either my Atlantis zine or some of the merch. Please, if you haven't got anything yet, pick something up, support the channel. I did drop the prices a little bit. The zines are $6 digital. Print copy is $10 plus shipping. And the shirt and hat are still available. Super limited edition, and they're both really nice. So, yeah, take care. Thanks very much.